Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we discuss Scandinavian democratic socialism. In the second half of our show, we'll speak with Anders Vistisen, the youngest member of the European Parliament, representing the Danish People's Party from Denmark. Up first, we're pleased to welcome best-selling food and travel writer Michael Booth, author of The Almost Nearly Perfect People, Behind the Myth of Scandinavian Utopia. Michael, welcome to the show.
Hi, Bill. Good to talk to you.
Michael, I asked you on the program to share your personal observations about the narrative that Scandinavians have somehow perfected the arts of happy living and good governance. Denmark and Sweden are back in the news, held up by some presidential candidates as democratic socialist utopias. Before we get on to some of the challenges the Nordic countries are facing, let's examine Danish happiness, which is how you start your book. Denmark regularly ranks first in the world in self-reported happiness. So how come they have the second highest consumption of antidepressants?
That's a very interesting paradox, isn't it? I'm not sure the two things are connected, but firstly, that word happiness is the one I always take issue with. I don't think the Danes are happy in the American sense of the word. I think they're very content and satisfied. I think they have low expectations, and I think they're very good at making the most of what they have. So happiness, I think there may be a linguistic thing, a kind of cultural thing. You know, if you ask Japanese people, are you happy? It seems boastful to say you're happy. If you ask Americans and they say they're not happy, you almost feel like a failure. The Danes, they don't want to be a burden on the other people if they say they're not happy. In the last few years, I think it's become a bit of a self-fulfilling branding exercise. The Danes are aware they're thought of as the happiest people in the world. So it's quite a nice reputation to have, isn't it?
And also, they seem to be pretty good tipplers as well, aren't they?
Yeah, and why do you think I live here? You know, they love it. This is Carlsberg land. Every social interaction is kind of lubricated with alcohol.
Speaking of that, the Danes rate themselves as being happy about their health, yet they have the highest cancer rates in the world, the lowest average lifespan of any Nordic country, and they do tend to go for the booze and cigarettes. What accounts for the gap between self-reported health and objective health statistics?
I actually think the Danes are very good at denial. I know that sounds a bit of a rough thing to say. Denial isn't necessarily a bad thing. We're all in denial of something, right, Bill? You know, we're in denial of mortality. I'm in denial of my receding hairline. The Danes are kind of in denial of their bad health, but they stay happy. You know, this old saw about, you know, well, at least I've got my health. The Danes don't really have that. You're right. They have the highest cancer rates in the world. They're a pretty a slovenly bunch. I wouldn't say slovenly, but they like the cigarettes, they like their booze, they like their fatty pork, and they also eat more candy per capita than anyone else in the world. But maybe here lies the recipe for happiness.
Happiness also seems to come from not working so hard. Your book claims that Danes are rated just behind the Belgians as the world's laziest, working the fewest hours and taking very long vacations. Is it true that thanks to the generous unemployment, disability, and welfare policies, Denmark is the best place in the world to be laid off?
It has been called that. Those policies have changed quite dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years. They've really had to tighten in the welfare state. But it is true. I mean, lazy, that's quite a pejorative term, Bill. I wouldn't call the Danes lazy. They are very productive when they're at their desks. But it is true they work fewer hours than just about any other OECD country. But the other side of that is, as an American, you'd be well aware, you know, life quality isn't so great when you're working late nights and weekends all the time. You know, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy.
Well, what percent of the Danish working age population does absolutely no work whatsoever?
Oh, I don't have the percentage to hand. But, I mean, there are some interesting cases where people have managed to play the system for 10, 12, 15 years, being perfectly able to work, but not. But they've been highlighted in Denmark, and they've been kind of the catalyst for some changes in the last few years.
Is there any resentment of people who live on the dole? Don't Danes pay the highest tax rates in the world?
Danes do indeed pay the highest tax rates in the world. But the weird thing, Bill, is there's very little political appetite for reducing those taxes. And here's why. The vast majority of Danes get as much, if not more, than what they've put in. And we're talking the middle class here. You know, it's a country of a middle class with a very small elite and a growing working class, low-skilled class, but still it's a large middle class. These are people, ordinary working people on average incomes with kids, and you know they are very grateful for the free schools, the free universities. They're grateful for the free healthcare, or they work in the public sector. You know, a large number of people work or receive benefits from the public sector. So, you know, it would be like the turkeys voting for Thanksgiving if people wanted to reduce taxes and reduce the public sector, because everyone benefits.
Michael, you write that Danes are also famous for having the highest personal debt-to-income ratio of any country in the Western world, owing on average 300% of their annual income, which is 4 times the personal debt of Italians. They're not much of a saving nation either. What's that all about?
Well, again, I think it's about this safety net. They're not going to fall too far if things go badly wrong. I think it may be the downside of the high taxes. They still want their nice Audis. They want their winter breaks in Thailand. So they do it on the never. They do it on the credit cards. And it's true, they have high level of private debt. A lot of that is linked to their property. We had a property boom a few years ago, which was encouraged by a kind of laissez-faire government. So a lot of people invested property. The property prices went up, property prices crashed, people are in negative equity. So I think a lot of that debt is explained by that. But it's also they have a kind of rather carefree attitude towards money, and they're very, very adept at borrowing from as many sources as they can find. And the other downside of the high taxes is they have a huge black market here. You know, many Danes, obviously not me, I would never pay for anything without, nothing under the table here. But, they'll slip some money to the electrician or the plumber or the builder, and it will go off the records, There are ways around the high taxes.
How long have you lived in Denmark?
On and off for about 10 years. I escaped for a few years and lived in Paris for a while, but I came back because actually Denmark is the best country in the world, I think, for raising kids. It's just fantastic for children. Well,
you mentioned that Danish parents seem to give their children a tremendous amount of freedom to roam and take risks. I mean, compared to the stereotypical American helicopter parent. How does this square with a society in which the adults are bound by an extraordinary number of rules, regulations, and restrictive social norms?
Well, they're two completely different things. I think there's an innocence, in a sense, to Denmark. A lot of it reminds me of Britain in the 50s and 60s. Where people aren't kind of paranoid about the paedophile in the bushes. Like, the British media, for example, and probably American, is always playing up these threats because it sells newspapers. Denmark is not quite like that. They assess the risks. They realize that children need to go and climb trees and swim in the sea in the winter and do all sorts of moderate risk things. Plus, they have the freedom to travel on great public transport. Crime is relatively low here. There's extremely high level of trust in Denmark. According to some reports, they have the highest level of trust in the world. And there's this amazing social cohesion, which also comes partly from having a homogenous group of people, who think the same, do the same, But also, I think when you have a very equal society, that's another of the benefits.
Probably the Danish culture to things that seem a little odd to Americans. What is a Danish law of jante? Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, jante law. Well, it's not an actual law, Bill. It stems from a book written in the 30s, and it's a list of kind of social norms in Scandinavia, how to behave in Scandinavia, which still apply quite widely, even in cosmopolitan areas. And there's things like you should not think you're better than us, you should not think you can teach us anything, you should not laugh at us. It's about keeping people in their place, not having too many aspirations. It's about reining in individualism, which is maybe something you guys over on your side of the Atlantic could take a look at.
Wrapping up the Happy Danes, what's this thing they call hygge?
Hygge. Yeah, it's a spirit of kind of coziness and conviviality. And, when the winters are long and cold and dark, it gets the Danes through those dark months. They light the fire, they open a bottle of red wine, they remember their summer holidays, and that's hygge. I mean, it exists in Germany, it exists in Holland, they even have words for it elsewhere in Europe, but the Danes are generally considered to be past masters of having a kind of convivial, cozy time.
We're speaking with food and travel writer Michael Booth, author of The Almost Nearly Perfect People, Behind the Myth of Scandinavian Utopia, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. To hear more programs like this, please stop by RadioFreeUK.org or follow our podcast on YouTube. And to keep up with the latest news and commentary in this hot election year, check out America's premier independent political website, RealClearPolitics.com. Ahead, we'll ask Michael about the legendary reputation of the Swedes for honesty, along with their affection for a unique form of consumable turpentine called aquavit. Stay tuned.
The Competitive Enterprise Institute is a nonprofit public interest group based in Washington, D.C., promoting innovation and entrepreneurship for a prosperous and peaceful society. Visit CEI.org to learn more.
Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're speaking with food and travel writer Michael Booth, author of The Almost Nearly Perfect People, Behind the Myth of Scandinavian Utopia. Michael, let's move on to Sweden, a country I'm more familiar with, having worked for Ericsson back in the 1990s. Belying its reputation as a Nordic welfare state, Sweden's gone through some significant reforms, including tax and spending cuts and privatization of many services. And unlike the more carefree Danes or the oil-subsidized Norwegians, Swedish companies have done quite well in global competition. How would you characterize Sweden today?
Sweden is in a massive state of almost emergency flux. That's really been instigated by the immigration crisis. The Swedes are questioning everything right now. The political arena is totally up in the air. But you're right, it has had a huge success with these big corporations, things like IKEA, Volvo, not even so well-known companies, but just the Swedes make ball bearings really well, and these boring little grommets and bits and bobs, and they conquer the world without anyone really noticing. And they're also, should be said, very proficient arms manufacturers. But they've done this because they have this amazing kind of social consensus. Big companies, they rely on a lot of people moving in the same direction. They don't have much time for the Danish mentality, which is everyone thinks they have the best solution to everything and they're going to try it regardless of what the managing director wants. In Sweden, they ask everyone if they're going to change the operating system on the computers. The tea lady has a vote kind of situation. So once they get everyone on board, the big corporations move in the right direction. I don't know if that was your experience at Ericsson.
Absolutely. It was a consensus-driven, spec-driven, everybody gets around the table and talks it out culture, although the Swedes seem to be very taciturn in nature. You noticed that in your book as well. What does this say about their national character?
The further north you go, the less people speak. It seems to be the general rule. The jokey theory is it's just too damn cold to stop on the street and chat. So, the other interesting theory is this high and low context society theory, where everyone knows what everyone else is thinking. When they all are kind of homogenous and the same, it's a high context society. Words aren't so necessary. You can say a lot with a look or an intake of breath. You don't need to verbalize everything. You see this especially with the Finns, but also in Sweden. There's also the fear of appearing stupid. Sounds ridiculous. We all have that fear. But there's this word in Sweden called duktig, and it means kind of being smart and not smart, overly clever, but just competent. And the Swedes live in permanent fear of being exposed as not knowing what they're doing. So they prefer to keep their mouth shut. It's not a bad policy. Maybe I should have tried it a bit more in my career.
If I could share a story related to keeping your mouth shut. In the 6 years that I worked for Ericsson, first as an employee and then a consultant, I was never lied to by a Swede, not even once, which I found quite astounding. But I almost always suffered from the fact that they were not very forthcoming when it came to sharing information that might have spared me a lot of aggravation. I finally learned the magic question to pry information out of them, and that is, do you know anything about this that you think I need to know?
Yes.
And if you say that to a Swede, all of a sudden, boom, they crack open. Did you also find them to be unusually honest, but yet hiding things?
Well, they're very blunt. You're right. Scandinavians are very blunt. They don't beat about the bush, particularly Danes. Danes pride themselves on getting straight to the point. Swedes are a little bit more sophisticated, refined, diplomatic, and I think that's probably what you experience. But if you ask them their opinion, they'll give it to you straight. And that's kind of refreshing. I lived in France for some years, and you have to work very hard to get to the truth in France. In Britain, we're kind of burdened by this baroque system of manners and politeness and humour that kind of conceals the truth often. But in Scandinavia, if you want the truth, they'll happily give it to you.
I heard the word lagom a lot working with Swedes. What does it actually mean?
It's kind of a sense of moderation in all things, and it's supposed to, I don't believe it, but it's supposed to stem from Vikings sitting around a fire, passing around the horn of mead. And so you would just take lagom, just enough, and then you pass it on to the next person. And, you can see that still permeating Swedish society. It's a society of moderation from the political sphere to the social sphere. They don't enjoy conspicuous consumption so much. It's back to the Jantelov thing of not thinking you are anything special, not being too greedy, Bill,
I don't know much about me, but I certainly remember the aquavit. Toasting norms and rituals are an important part of Swedish hospitality. Did they ever make you sing Hej Går?
Oh, yeah. I've sung a few of those songs, and I've had the hangovers afterwards. The Swedes, they have a love-hate, a love-love relationship with alcohol, but the state has stood in and said, let's control this a bit. So they have the state monopoly on alcohol. You can't get a drink on a Sunday, that kind of thing. But when they let rip, as they do often at their crayfish festivals, for example, in the summer, I went to Malmo for the world's biggest crayfish festival, which happens every August. And my God, it's like Sodom and Gomorrah. They're standing on the tables, they're knocking back this 40% aquavit. It's quite something to behold, quite frightening actually seeing Swedes let rip. And the songs are very important. And if you don't know the words of the songs, you kind of feel a bit of an idiot.
Michael, you indicated in your book that you often intentionally provoked Swedes with unorthodox behavior just to gauge their precise position on what you call the Scandinavian social autistic spectrum. Share some of those stories with us.
Well, I spent a day in Stockholm behaving as un-Swedishly as I possibly could. So this involved in museums, drinking under no drinking signs, eating a bag of crisps loudly, crossing the road on a pedestrian crossing when it was a red light, and people tutted at me for that. I think the Swedes can sometimes seem a little robotic, a little bit Stepford Wives. There's a book written recently called Is the Swede a Human? And it's supposedly a rhetorical question, but it is a question I've asked myself sometimes when I've been among the Swedes. They do have this extraordinary social conformity, which I think Americans would find quite alarming, actually.
Despite many reforms, Sweden remains one of the most highly regulated societies in the world. Their labor laws make it almost impossible to fire anyone, and union leaders are often guaranteed seats on corporate boards. And yet, unlike the French, Swedish entrepreneurs seem to be doing fine, particularly in fields like software. How do you account for that?
Yeah, again, America prides itself on being this high-risk nation of Donald Trumps, right? But in truth, when you have this great safety net, you're not so afraid to take risks. So Sweden has given us Skype and Spotify, and these countries are also ranked among the best for doing business because of the freedom. In France, for example, where I've lived, if you want to do a deal, you get lawyers involved and there's lots of contracts and you just assume everyone's going to cheat you. In Scandinavia, they don't need so many lawyers. They don't need so many contracts because there's, again, this amazing level of trust. And one great example of where that bore fruit for Denmark was the wind turbine industry in the 70s, where these companies were growing up and they were sharing their innovations, sharing their research with each other. And Denmark ended up having one of the world's leading wind turbine industries. And the same thing I think you can see in Sweden.
Swedes often describe themselves as xenophobic, yet Sweden seems to be the leading Nordic pioneer of multiculturalism, welcoming more immigrants than any other Scandinavian country. You mentioned earlier that this is bubbling up into some troubles. Bring us up to date on how this experiment is playing out.
Well, it's playing out very badly. Sweden has had an open door policy for particularly Syrian immigrants in the last 5 years. They're suddenly realizing they can't really handle the numbers of, non-Western immigrants. Going into Copenhagen on the train every day, I was seeing carriages full of Syrians and Somalis coming through Denmark to get to Sweden. Sweden realized this is not going to be sustainable. A couple of months ago, they put a block on the bridge between Denmark and Sweden. So those immigrants started to build up in Denmark. Denmark put up a block on the German border in turn, so now they're building up in Germany. It's a domino effect really caused by the Swedes because they welcomed and they were on their high horse morally. We're the great humanist nation. Come all you Syrians who need help. The Syrians came. The Swedes said, oops. It was a bit like, when a teenager puts out a party on Facebook and suddenly 10,000 people turn up and destroy the house. Swedes are having to deal with that right now. And they've created a problem for Denmark. They've created a problem for a lot of Europe, actually. We're not getting that many apologies from Sweden. But, you've seen the rise of the right-wing political party there, quite an ugly party with its roots in neo-Nazism back in the 80s. Sweden is really going into a major period of introspection, I think, right now.
Scandinavia leads the world in gender equality, and it's probably fair to say the Muslim world lags pretty far behind. How is that clash going to be resolved?
Well, the positive me says that as Muslims integrate into Scandinavia and see how great the society is and how free they can be, they will adapt. And that is the case in many cases. I think the sheer numbers right now are a problem. And this is an unusual scenario kind of caused by the West, you could argue. So we have to take responsibility for it. But that doesn't help integrate 25,000 people into a country of 5 million people. It's a problem. I don't think there's a simple answer, Bill.
If you look at the hopeful side, how do second and third generation children of immigrants who came in the past fare when it comes to assimilation into Scandinavia?
Tellingly, the girls are doing much better than the boys. I think the girls see this amazing chance for emancipation, freedom, education. And in school, as I understand it, the children of immigrants, the females, are doing extremely well. The boys, on the other hand, that's the problem, and that's where you're seeing this radicalization happening in some of the cities in Scandinavia, in Sweden and Denmark. And from that, we had an appalling gun attack last Valentine's Day last year in Copenhagen. There have been attempts in Sweden as well. It's a problem that's not going to go away. There's a huge disaffected Muslim male population who feel unwanted and second-rate citizens and are persecuted, but also bringing their own problems. It's almost, I think, an intractable problem, unfortunately.
So, Michael, sum up all the pluses and minuses for us Americans. What lessons does Scandinavia have for us?
Well, in many ways, your friend Bernie Sanders is right. America badly needs a dose of economic equality. Your country is out of kilter badly. And I think that's the fundamental lesson that Scandinavian has for the whole world, actually. Economic and gender equality. Now, whether you can bear to achieve that through redistribution of taxes is another matter. But it's an ideal worth shooting for, because from economic equality comes everything is better. Lower crime, happier people, things function better. If you look at the classic example is South Africa. If you're living as a rich person in South Africa, you live a life behind barbed wire, looking out at poverty. In Scandinavia, we don't have that much barbed wire. We have an equal society in which everyone benefits. That's the biggest lesson, I think, from the world.
Well, Michael, your book of stories was a delight. Thanks so much for coming on the show, and please keep in touch.
You're so welcome, Bill. It's been a pleasure.
There's one view behind the myth of Scandinavian utopia from travel writer Michael Booth here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, which the New York Times has called an invaluable tool for anyone interested in politics or public affairs. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. We'd like to thank our long-term sponsor, Old Boston Restorations, for their support. Old Boston is a boutique property management company in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.net. Ahead, we'll speak with Anders Vistisen, the youngest member of the European Parliament, about the turmoil engulfing Europe's social democracies. Stay tuned.
The Competitive Enterprise Institute is a nonprofit public interest group based in Washington, D.C., promoting innovation and entrepreneurship for a prosperous and peaceful society. Visit CEI.org to learn more.
Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Anders Vistisen, the youngest member of the European Parliament, representing the Danish People's Party, part of Denmark's rapidly growing Eurosceptic movement. We caught up with Anders on Radio Row at CPAC, where he was studying the colorful world of U.S. conservatives. Anders, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Anders, at 26 years old, you began your term the youngest of all 751 members of the European Parliament. How did you pull that off?
You know, when you get elected, it's the voters who decide if you're young or old. But it helps that in Denmark, in all European elections, it's a proportionate system. So if you have a party that is on the rise, or you run for a party on the rise, it's easier to get in as a new face. And our party have been very successful, going from 1 to 4 MEPs in the European Parliament. So there was a bit of room for me, but of course it was a hard campaign, and we were very happy to get the personal votes needed to get in.
Tell us a little about your campaign, because we here in the U.S. are not familiar with what it's like over there in Denmark.
I was chairman of the youth wing at the time, so I had a lot of young support for my campaign, quite also geographical support due to the fact that I was a member of local city council and the region council where I came from. So I sort of have my base there, and luckily it was enough to beat the other candidates on the list, and I got in on my personal votes.
Did you use a lot of social media? What was the campaign? Television or no?
No, actually it's illegal in Denmark to do television ad for politicians.
Really?
Yeah, so you cannot do that. Of course you can make YouTube videos and so, but
no broadcast.
No broadcast. So we did much of the social media, but also a lot of town hall, door-to-door campaigning, sort of the very basics that I think all campaigns have
Real
to do.
old school kind of campaigning.
So it was sort of a mixed batch.
Tell us about the Danish People's Party. It's relatively new among the European conservatives and reformists.
Yeah, it's a relatively new party. It's only 20 years old. We sort of took over where we believed that the other right-wing parties in Denmark had failed on the conservative agenda. We actually have a conservative party in Denmark that is so unconservative that it's almost eradicated now. So we are the leading party, especially on social conservatism.
And what are the key tenets of the party?
We were based on sort of a Eurosceptic basis, also more regulated migration, so we don't have this, what we see now, chaotic situation. We'll get to that, but that's a very important step for our party. But also law and order, justice, family values.
What about economic policies?
We have been doing very much to balance the Danish budget, to pay off the debt. Actually, we have succeeded in these 20 years have gone since then to have one of the biggest steps of an EU country to pay it all off during the early years of this millennium. So that was quite successful when we had the last centre-right government.
I understand personal debt in Denmark is among the highest in the world. What does that say about the Danish people?
I think it's have something to do with our subprime system that is quite safe. So many own their own property with quite a big subprime debt. It's difference in capitalization of property that makes it so significantly stand out from the rest of Europe.
Let's look at wider EU policy, and let me ask an economic question. Who bears greater responsibility for the lack of economic growth across the EU, the regulators or the central banks and monetary authorities?
I think they have an equal blame on this. The problem is, when you have a corporation like the European Union, you make rules, you make common rules. We would do the same if we had to share.
I understand there's like 5,000 pages of rules on cabbages.
Yeah. But the problem is that when the big guys don't want to follow the rules, they don't. So the first country not to follow the Eurozone rules was Germany. And if Germany don't follow the rules, you cannot enforce them on the small guys.
Well, how so? Give an example.
We had rules saying how much public debt you could have. You could make 1 year.
Yeah, that's right.
You had a cap on how much debt per capita or per BNP.
Yep.
And Germany started not following the rules. Not very significantly, but you could have 3%. They started to have 4%, have 5%. You could have 60% of DDI in debt. They started sort of to go over that, and not much because Germany is still a relatively good economy. But when you don't enforce the rules on Germany, how could you do it on Greece, on Italy,
of course, France? Good luck.
When you send that signal, everyone breaks the rules. It's like a speeding limit. If you don't enforce it,
right,
everyone will go fast on the highway.
So I'm quite familiar with entrepreneurship in Sweden, having worked for a Swedish company for a while, and particularly in the software areas, they're actually renowned. What's the status of entrepreneurship in Denmark?
We are very good at creating new businesses. What our major problem is to grow small businesses into medium-sized businesses and big business.
They had a wall.
They had a wall. Actually, they always stipulated that Denmark should be the best place to start a business, but it's a very, very bad place to grow a business.
So it's all mom and pop, little family operation.
Yeah. 1-2-man operations, consultancies, especially a lot of service providers.
Is this because of employment law or tax law?
It is bureaucracy, primarily, I think. If I have a one-person business and I want to have one employee, all sort of national and EU regulations kick in. I actually run the youth wing, as I said, and we had just one student employee. It took me more time as chairman of the organization to do her payment and insurance and all the stuff following than her actual working hours of 8 hours a week. So it was, yes, you have to have mandatory employee conversations 2 times a year, even though it's a 2-man operation. You have to have a safety committee consisting of employers and employees, even though it's a 2, 3, 4-man operation.
Well, why do people put up with this?
It's Europe. Everything's regulated.
Well, it has a consequence. Youth unemployment in the European Union varies from a low of 7% in Germany to 50% in countries like Greece and Spain. I think the average is about 22% across the EU as a whole. How did your generation end up becoming the lost generation?
I think, when the economy in general is bad, it hits the youngest generation hardest. If you make a great debt, you give it to your children. If you run a bad economy, the one that suffers the most is the one getting out to the employment market. If you have a good job, you'll probably keep it.
You're protected,
Yeah. So I actually think there is a youth unemployment issue. But to solve it, you need to fix the economy. So instead of, in Europe, we are very good at sort of making all these nanny programs, making sort of a specific targeted thing and pick the winner, all these kind of things. But instead of that, we should focus on repairing the fundamental economy. And then we'll be able to get more people out in jobs, create new jobs. Otherwise, you'll not have more young people having a job.
Well, this is the rising tide theory, but there's also a very big social safety net. I mean, I was told that Denmark's probably the best place in the world to be unemployed.
We're also one of the most heavily taxed places in the world, so that goes together, you know.
Right. Why work?
Yeah. Actually, the problem of sort of people living off benefits are not in particular a youth problem in Denmark. It's more a social problem. You inherit a poor work ethic. We can see that in statistics.
Yeah.
It's also, to some extent, a migration problem. We have specific groups of migrants having a very hard time getting into the workforce.
Economy.
Yeah. So I don't think it's in particular a work problem. What we do that is a problem for unemployment is that sometimes the education we provide to our young people is just educating them to unemployment. We have way too many in social studies, social science.
Well, we have that problem here too.
And it's not really qualified. We cannot have everyone doing thesis on each other. And we actually see in our economy that we have bottlenecks in craft skills, carpenters, blacksmiths, so
plumbers,
on.
They do pretty well.
Yeah. And at the same time, we have academics that we can feed pigs with them.
Unemployed PhDs.
Yeah. And it's a great problem, especially because, we have been focusing way too much on just getting people through some sort of college, not focusing on what we need in the other end.
Right. There's a lot of people who are concerned about that trend. Great Britain is in the midst of a referendum that will decide whether their country stays in the European Union or comes out. Any guess on how that might resolve itself?
I think it's going to be a very tight election on Brexit. I will say I hope for the best but feel the worst.
Well, what is the best and what is the worst?
It depends if you're British or Danish. But if you are Danish, you would very much like to have the UK in the European Union. UK have been a common sense voice in the European Union, talking for less union, more place for the national states, less regulation from Brussels, more free market, not protectionism like France and Italy and Spain.
Sure.
So
if you lose that voice, that's a problem.
Yeah, it's a big country, and we need them to counterbalance Merkel in Germany, Holland in France. But I do understand Brits who want to leave the European Union.
Will they be better off if they leave?
It's a hard question. We've never tried it before, so it's sort of an experiment. But I think that there will not be a catastrophe for Britain if they leave, but there might be some ramifications.
What do you make of the Greek bailout? Is there any hope of economic recovery in Greece while they remain lashed to the euro?
No.
That was a simple answer.
It's like handcuffs. They are handcuffed themselves to so much debt within the euro that they cannot really get out of it.
Yeah.
They cannot get ahead. So it's sort of just a snowball going down the hill because, we have imposed physical discipline on a country that's not used to physical discipline.
Sure.
And that debt is just rising towards Germany. Then we give them money to pay off the debts. We are lending them money just to pay interest rates on their old debt.
Well,
and you're not going to reconstruct the country that way. It will take decades to have Greece run again, but it will take even longer if we keep binding them to this Eurozone. It's not going to work for Greece.
We're speaking with Danish member of the European Parliament, Anders Vistisen, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, stop by RadioFreeUK.org and sign up for updates. And if you'd like to support more thoughtful programming like this, please hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. Ahead, we'll ask Anders about Europe's refugee crisis and why Denmark passed a law demanding that immigrants who apply for welfare surrender their valuables. Stay tuned.
The Competitive Enterprise Institute is a nonprofit public interest group based in Washington, D.C., promoting innovation and entrepreneurship for a prosperous and peaceful society. Visit CEI.org to learn more.
Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're speaking with Anders Vistisen, the youngest member of the European Parliament, representing the Danish People's Party from Denmark. So, Anders, Europe is facing a tremendous immigration crisis with both political and economic refugees washing in from Muslim lands, ranging from North Africa to Afghanistan. A sense of panic seems to be setting in as one country after another slowly closes its borders, with migrants banking up into their entry point in Greece. Economics aside, and we'll get back to that, how concerned are you about public safety, given the increased violence reported by the press, particularly violence by young male refugees?
It is a security concern for Europe. There has been an enormous increase in violent crimes, murder, rapes, all kind of things from these migrant populations. In my little country, Denmark, 5 million inhabitants, maybe roughly the size of Maryland, police estimate that more than 100,000 illegal migrants have crossed the border, and we have no way of knowing who they are, where they went. We hope most of them went to Sweden, but we don't know.
You don't know for
and
sure.
If you have 100,000 going through, you don't take a handful to make a terrorist cell. It only takes a few to make a crazy attack like the one we've seen in California here. And
there's also
Paris.
everyday crime. It's not just that kind of a jihadist crime.
No, you also have sort of the influx of violent crime. We see that actually Malmö in Sweden, the second largest city there, has the highest murder rate in the Western Hemisphere, even higher than you can find anywhere in the United States.
I didn't know that.
No, and
worse than Detroit, worse than Camden?
Chicago, worse than
Chicago.
Where you find they have more murders per capita than anywhere else in the Western Hemisphere.
Well, the Danes are very law-abiding citizens, right? These are the people who won't cross where the light is red, there's no cars, they won't cross the street.
No.
How do you get immigrants to assimilate into that kind of law-abiding culture?
It actually depends very much on the culture you come with. We don't have any real problem with crimes from Asian communities in Denmark, from Western communities, Australians, Americans, South Americans coming. It's a very specific problem concentrated around the Middle East, some North African countries, Afghanistan. We have seen in old statistics they're very, very hard to assimilate into Danish society, unfortunately.
Does Denmark have any no-go zones similar to the French Benelux where the police pretty much don't go?
We have zones where the police cannot come without severe backup. We talk multiple.
Severe backup?
Yeah. Even firefighters and ambulances will not go into this area without police escorts.
Sounds like the Bronx when I was a kid.
I wasn't there, but I guess it's pretty much the same thing. You know, we have ghetto areas where it's not safe for public servants to go unless they're heavily protected by firearms.
Are you concerned that vigilantes might begin administering rough justice if authorities don't get the situation under control?
I don't think we're there in Denmark yet, but we see in Sweden that have had
gangs.
We see gangs. We see street thugs taking the street, white supremacists doing this kind of thing. And that's not the solution to any problem, but it is a cry from frustration from a population where you don't deal with these issues.
Well, what about the economic side? Denmark recently passed a law that says immigrants must surrender their valuables if they expect to collect public assistance. What's that all about?
Actually, the same rule is applying to Danish citizens. You know, you cannot get a dime from the state before you spend your own money.
Really?
Yeah.
And they do audits? They'll check your accounts?
When you go down, they say, I want unemployment benefits. We say, yeah, okay, have you sold your car off? Do you have an expensive household? Then you have to sell it. If you have a new big flat screen TV, you can sell that and get an old one that is cheaper and so on. We are just trying to make an equal standing here because it is a welfare state and very expensive. Last year alone, if we sort of compare to the US and scaled up again, the US should spend just last year alone more than $100 billion more on migrants in the US that single year just to have sort of the equivalent of what we spent on the migrants coming that year alone. Then we don't take into account all the money we spend of the migrants have been coming for the last 20, 30, 40 years.
Well, what is it about Danish law that obliges you to provide welfare to non-citizens?
Some EU laws require it. Also, the European Human Rights Convention require us to do it. It's very hard to tighten these laws more than we've already done. We've actually tried sort of to sort this out, but due to all these conventions we have signed for some stupid reasons, we cannot really do much else. That's why this proposal came up. That's one of the things you could actually do. You could demand people spending their own money before they got welfare from the state.
So when immigrants arrive with their family jewels or gold coins, sewn into their dress, are you really starting to take it away? No,
we've said that all things of affectionate value you don't take. So if you have a personal cell phone, I don't take that. If you have your wedding ring, I don't take that. If you have a family heirloom, your grandmother's old jewelry, we will not take that. This is if you come with big amount of cash. If you come with 10 iPhones, I might take the 9 and let you keep your personal ones. And we're not taking it. It's confiscated, and then the valuables that is not spent to pay for your medical services, your housing needs, your food needs, you will have refunded. So it's not like we just take.
You actually keep an account.
We keep an account, and
Good Lord, that sounds complicated.
Yeah, it is a very complicated system, but it's the same system we have in place for Danish and welfare. So you can say.
So the system's already set up.
It's not an add-on system. It's just including these people in an already existing system in Denmark.
I understand Denmark's been publishing ads in Lebanese newspapers warning potential immigrants that welfare benefits for arriving immigrants have been sharply cut. Has that slowed the flow? We can see that Denmark is taking a less percentage of the migrants overall, but because the number have so skyrocketed, even though we take a less percentage, it's still a lot of more people.
people believe actually that they can come to Denmark and from day one have a free car at their disposal, a house for their family and so on. That's the belief they're coming with. Actually, we have people coming now.
Asking for it
In our refugee camp saying, okay, let me just go back because this was not the free ride we were hoping for. And we said, we thought you were refugees. We thought you wanted protection. No, we just wanted to have this great life without paying anything. So we just withdraw our application to be refugees in Denmark and go home. It's nicer there.
No.
Yes, there's example of that in Denmark, in Germany, in Sweden.
So this is an advertising problem.
I think so. If I was fleeing from Nazi Germany and I found out that going to the US, coming to Brooklyn, that, I didn't get my car, I didn't get my house.
That would still be fine.
I think I would not go back to Nazi Germany for that reason. And then I think, if you're a real refugee, of course you'll settle for having a roof over your head, plenty of food, free education.
Is there an informal economy, the underground economy in Denmark, where they work off the books?
Not so much in Denmark. You have a quite regulated system.
Because that's how it works here in the U.S.
Yeah, I know. But I think in Germany you'll see more and more of that. Especially now, you have this very stupid idea to make quotas to distribute these migrants throughout the European countries. Eastern Europe will not take any, for good reasons.
Sure.
And they have said more or less, we'll take our quota, but we'll not control if they're here in Germany. So you'll see all the quota refugees sent to Eastern Europe. All of them will be sort of an underground black economy in places like Germany, Holland, Belgium, where they can go in and sort of live under a radar.
So if you follow the news, one by one, countries seem to be, if not closing their borders, at least vastly controlling the flows. There's a tremendous backup that's taken place. What they call the Balkan routes being shut down. Macedonia is a mess right now. All of this backs up into Greece. How do they fix that?
I think we need to take the rural refugees, not the economical free riders that wants to sort of use the situation. Even the European Commission states that 2/3 of the people coming to Europe is not refugees. They are economical migrants. To really even begin doing anything, we need to have secure borders. And in Europe, we'd never protected the external borders when we tore apart the internal borders.
U.S. presidential candidate Bernie Sanders has called Denmark a socialist paradise. Is he right?
To some extent, it is what we call a welfare state in Europe. The Scandinavian countries are known to be the most extreme welfare state nations in Europe. But I think you have to take into account the very huge cultural differences there are between a country like the US and a small, very homogeneous society as the Danish, Norwegian or Swedish societies.
So, for example, why wouldn't that system work here?
First of all, it will demand a huge amount of redistribution of wealth and tax levels that will be totally unprecedented in the American system. The personal tax in Denmark for high incomes would be above 50%. Car taxes is 150%.
150%?
Yes, on every car you buy. And it's actually coming down. It was 180% before that for many, many years. The VAT is 25%. You'll have to have such a redistribution of wealth to have such a society that it's not very feasible to do any place in the world. I could not recommend anyone to do it. It's very hard to dismount again.
But that's pretty much Bernie's campaign.
I could imagine, but if that's what America wants, they can vote for Bernie Sanders. But I don't think that most Americans realize what kind of change to society it will be to go from the American system to a Scandinavian welfare model.
So, Anders, as a young man starting off your political career as a member of the European Parliament, with some skepticism, what do you see ahead?
I see that the European Union either have to go back to basics, to be a free market zone, concentrate on trade, concentrate on what we do best, or it will crash and burn. All the great accomplishments of Europe, the Eurozone, the Schengen cooperation, the Eastern expansion, all of those are in tremendous crisis, and all of them are somehow or another sort of making this European project, it's an Achilles heel for it. So either you have to go back to basics, do what Europe was good at, trade, or you will see that the European Union will not exist in the form we know it in 10 or 20 years.
So, Anders, wrapping things up, we're in the midst of a bizarre election year. No one knows exactly what to expect in the fall. As a young foreigner looking around at the American political system, what do you see?
I see a lot of anger in the American people on both sides. I see candidates that a couple of years ago, I don't think anyone would have expected getting any traction at all in a presidential election. And I think that the political establishment have to take that seriously. Otherwise, they'll lose control over the situation. Maybe they already, to some extent, have lost some control over the situation. Personally, America is a very important ally to any Western country. We are looking for American leadership, and we are looking for a president that can fix the relationship, especially to the old Europe. So that's what I personally hope for in the new president. But it's very exciting to see where it will go.
Well, Anders, thanks so much for sharing your perspective with us. Thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thank you.
That was Danish member of the European Parliament, Anders Vistisen, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on iTunes or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And while you're at it, take a look at RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Old Boston Restorations, a Victorian property management company in Boston South End. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station, when we take an inside look at entrepreneurship on 2 continents. See you then.
The Competitive Enterprise Institute is a nonprofit public interest group based in Washington, D.C., promoting innovation and entrepreneurship for a prosperous and peaceful society. Visit CEI.org to learn more.